So hello, everybody. I'm Peter Larson with the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm really happy to be again with Michael Bueckert, who is the Vice President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME. Michael, hello.
Hi, Peter. Happy to be here.
Michael, you just come out with, you were the lead author on an interesting report by CJPME that examined some internal examined legally through the access to information process, some internal correspondence in the Canadian government around our voting at the UN on the Israel-Palestine question in the year 2019. Can you just sort of give us a top-level summary of what you did and what you found?
Well, we looked at these release documents that had been requested at some point in the recent future, and once someone makes a request for this, it's publicly available. You just need to make a simple sort of request for these documents to be able to see them. And actually, we found that we found about 500 pages of documents of correspondence between Canadian officials at different levels in the bureaucracy, leading up to this vote in 2019, as Canada was considering to slightly modify its approach at the United Nations. Your viewers are probably likely aware that every year there's somewhere between 10 and 16 resolutions on Palestinian human rights that are voted at the UN. And 20 years ago, Canada voted for almost all of these. And that started to change slightly under Paul Martin, really started to change under Stephen Harper. And then once Harper got a majority in 2011, there was a very drastic change where Canada decided that it's just going to vote against all of them as a policy out of what they said was frustration with the process, and sort of a perceived that having too many resolutions was perceived to be unfair to Israel. And so they started that in 2011. And then when Trudeau came to power, he actually maintained that approach. He didn't go back to the pre-Harper era. He maintained it for 3 years completely. And then in 2019, there was a sort of a single step, an important symbolic step, where Canada switched back one of those 16 votes and started to vote for Palestinian self-determination. One of the, I guess, the more an important resolution, but one that doesn't explicitly criticize Israel. And I think that's some of the justification that went into switching that particular vote. And so basically, we found these documents from bureaucrats leading up to that decision, preparing a memo to the government, asking them to reevaluate their approach to the UN. And so we actually get to see what Canadian bureaucrats actually think about Canada's record at the UN. And it shows that actually Canadian bureaucrats are very critical, that they see that Canada's approach during the Harper era and so far under Trudeau, that Canada is voting against motions regardless of their merit, even when those resolutions are in alignment with what Canadian officials consider to be Canadian interests, values, and standard positions. And they were warning the Canadian government that actually this was damaging to its international reputation, that countries, many UN countries were seeing Canada's approach quite negatively and perceived Canada to lack objectivity on these issues, and said that we were so far out, that far away from even the UK and Australia, who are also somewhat laggards on these issues. And so from my perspective, from someone at CJPME, is actually quite interesting, because we've been making these kinds of arguments for a really long time, that Canada's policy at the UN is contradictory to what Canada says its official positions are, and that this is not good for its reputation. Now we know that Canadian officials behind the scenes are talking about these issues in the same way. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yes, it is remarkable, and in some senses, it's not surprising, but it's interesting to have it in black and white on paper. There are several levels of bureaucrats that can be involved. There are the folks who are on the ground in Ramallah or Tel Aviv. There are the folks in New York at our UN delegation. There are people at the West Pearson building. Which of these, did you see information coming from Ramallah or Tel Aviv, or was it mostly the exchange of information between the UN, our officials at the UN and Global Affairs headquarters?
So the main sort of documents we were looking at were sort of this memo that was drafted by Global Affairs Canada in Ottawa. They're sort of the head of their Israel division, the Israel desk. But it was indicated that this had been consulted with diplomatic staff in Ramallah and Tel Aviv, although most of the correspondence in those documents related to them was actually redacted for whatever reason. But there was, I guess, there were indications that they had sort of seen this memo and were in on it.
Right.
And then this memo was circulated to different places. So we heard feedback from Canada's representatives to the UN in New York. They were actually calling for a bolder approach to radically change Canada's approach and assess each motion on its individual merits rather than voting against them as a bloc. And the implication, as detailed in the memo, there were a number of resolutions on Palestine that they said they had identified as they would probably change and start voting for should this policy be put into place. And then also the same with the Global Affairs Canada officials also in Ottawa, but who are working specifically on UN Security Council issues. We're also calling for a similar approach where Canada would assess each resolution, as they called it, based on their merits, a merit-based approach. So there was certainly, I'm an outsider to this, but certainly there's a sense that these ideas are quite shared broadly within the civil service, but there was a lot of push, in particular, coming from those who are most closely working on issues related to the UN.
Do you have access to exchanges between Global Affairs, which is basically public servants, and the Prime Minister's office, what is sort of called here in Ottawa downtown? We know that historically there is a tension between the External Affairs Office and the Prime Minister's office. Did you have access to any of that correspondence?
No, unfortunately not. There were sort of indications that maybe the PMO, or maybe not, or at least somewhere in the political level, that there were lots of requests to, for example, the UN representatives for information about when voting is coming up and that kind of thing, and wanting a lot to micromanage what the UN representatives were doing, but no correspondence specifically with the PMO, although there was a summary of a meeting where apparently the PMO was open to this idea of changing a single vote. This was about 20 days before the vote actually happened. And despite this seeming agreement to go along with a small change, bureaucrats on the ground in New York were waiting for instructions on how they would vote right up until the last minute, after 10 a.m. on the day of the vote, really the last minute before they knew at all how Canada was going to vote. They actually even prepared some explanation of vote statements. And these are vote statements that are published after Canada makes a particularly unique vote that requires an explanation. They made two around votes for Palestinian refugees, where they spelled out, like, Canada's proud to vote for this resolution. It's consistent with Canadian support for refugees. They wrote these just in case they would be instructed to vote. They thought that these would be the most likely resolutions to change. Didn't end up using them because Canada voted against those resolutions, which officials were pointing out actually were consistent with Canadian policy.
Like a political candidate who writes out an acceptance speech and a resignation speech and has to figure out which one they're going to use. Now let's go into something that is perhaps more speculative, but based on, why do you think I'll say the PMO, although I don't know whether it's PMO or Global Affairs staff, but why are they not listening or not accepting the advice that they're getting from their people on the ground in New York and conceivably from Ramallah and Tel Aviv as well. Why do you think they are not going along with that advice?
It's a good question. I do get the sense that the leadership of the Liberal government under Trudeau is very much on sort of the extreme end of the party. If we look at political polling, for example, public polling, we find that supporters of the Liberal Party are far more interested in Palestinian rights than the government itself is. So there is a sense that sort of, if the Liberal Party is a spectrum, maybe 80% of the party is fairly good, and then Trudeau represents maybe the last 5 to 10%. So I feel like there's this big disconnect already, and then that carries into the public service, where these are people working on these issues for many years and have different interests other than just at a political level, or maybe looking at these issues not from a domestic politics perspective, but maybe from their own expertise or what they're hearing, and making it more of an independent analysis. I'm speculating because I'm obviously on the outside with a
Sure.
direct experience working in these sectors, but certainly it appears to be that there's significantly more nuance and sophistication among Canadian bureaucrats that is completely missing this total disconnect that it never seems to reach the political representatives.
Let me put two theses to you, which I'm sure you've heard of both before. One is external influence from domestic actors, the Israel lobby being one. Shimon Fogo is written up in Maclean's magazine as one of the top 10 lobbyists, or most of whatever, in Canada. So that's one potential source of pressure that the folks in New York wouldn't be exposed to as much. And the other is American pressure or interest, not even necessarily direct pressure, but worry by Canada that voting, because America did vote with Israel on all those issues, and voting against America has a certain cost. What do you think about the relative weight of both of those hypotheses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are both influences for sure. I think the pro-Israel lobby groups in Canada they're quite influential. They have these organizations that have been around for a while. They have close connections to all the political parties for the most part. And certainly there's been just decades and decades of building these narratives that criticizing Israel is the same as anti-Semitism, and that I think that has an influence. I think it's also sort of more on sort of the conservative end of the spectrum. I think that where those ideas are more prominent, and I think the fact that maybe the leadership of the Liberal Party might be more on the center right in terms of where the party could be. I don't know. There's lots of factors. I wouldn't put it all on sort of the pro-Israel lobby groups, but they're obviously one of a significant actor in this sort of public debate. And you're right that people working more deep in the bureaucracy would be more immune to that. And the other thing about the U.S. is definitely a factor. I think we're looking at this secret memo where they're talking about the problems with Canada's pro-Israel approach. And what's striking is that there's so much documentation for what's wrong with the approach Canada has been taking, but almost no justification at all for why, for to take the opposite side. Like there's no benefits laid out for Canada voting against all of these resolutions, with the exception of not destabilizing relations with the U.S. and Israel. That's really the only thing pointed out in that whole document that would lend sort of support to that. So there is sort of a sense that might be seen as the predominant factor in decision making that trumps out all of these other considerations. That reputation, Canada's relationship with these two countries is more important than Canada's relationship with the rest of the world. which is also interesting considering the timing of this memo, which was in the midst of a UN Security Council campaign. Canada was trying to get a seat on the Security Council. And I think this sort of provides more evidence to those who are saying that Canada's pro-Israel approach might have actually sort of helped to sabotage Canada's bid, noting that the G77, China, Arab countries, Western countries, everyone was expressing criticism of Canada's approach.
Michael, it was innovative use of the access to information. Good for you. The report's worth reading, and we'll see whether, in the face of this overwhelming evidence, the Canadian government reverses its policy. And I think that's probably not very likely. But anyway, Michael, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us here today. That's great.
Thanks so much, Peter. Really happy to chat about it.